all of a sudden this magnificent building emerges out of fairly barren farmland, and I can only imagine the impact that that had on Purdue students in the Purdue community.
Bob, thank you so much for joining us on This Is Purdue. We're here to talk about the Purdue Memorial Union, an iconic building to so many Boilermakers and just for this community overall. And you were the PMU director for over 2 decades. Let's kick things off. Let's talk about the history of PMU, what it means to our Boilermakers in this community. So this opened in 1924. We're about to celebrate 100 years. What's the early history of PMU? How did it come about? Tell us a little bit about that.
I think most of us in the union profession would agree that the college union movement, if you will, began in England in the early 19th century at Oxford and Cambridge universities. There was an Oxford Union and a Cambridge Union, but they were largely debate societies. And I find that interesting personally because when you think about debate, you think about the willingness to disagree, hopefully civilly, on a given topic. You think of divergent thought and opinion and free expression. These debating societies were very competitive, but eventually they extended each other the courtesies of when a visiting debater would come from one or the other of Oxford or Cambridge. They often would like a light lunch on the day of the debate. They would like to have a quiet reading room where they could prepare for the debate. They might have a dinner if that option was available. And they might even stay overnight if overnight accommodations were available. So when you think of those things and you think about unions today, the provision of cafeteria and meal service, quiet reading rooms and lounges, and in some cases overnight lodging, it's easy to see why those are considered the harbingers of the college union movement. This caught the attention and moved to North America and the United States. Some of the early adapters would be Harvard Union at Harvard University, Hart House at University of Toronto, and closer to home, the Michigan Union at the University of Michigan. But in around early 1900s, class of 1912, George O. Hayes, he was a student and he was the editor-in-chief then of the Exponent. And yes, the Exponent was here then.
Wow.
But he proposed through a series of editorials that Purdue should have a union. And as you might imagine, this captured the attention and imagination of students in particular, but actually very few others. Nevertheless, a constitution was drafted and fundraising began. Back in those days, fundraising was separate from the university. But unfortunately, in the 2 years before the onset of World War I, only $17,900 was raised. And you're talking about a facility that then was estimated to cost perhaps upwards of $1 million.
Wow.
However, by 1921, I'll talk a little bit about this later, almost $1 million was raised. And so that got Purdue's attention. They sought and were able to contract with Pond & Pond architects from Chicago, who I'll also talk about more. And the design for the union was made. And in 1922, ground was broken, and on September 9th, 1924, the Purdue Memorial Union opened. It was with temporary pine floors, unplastered ceilings and walls, a second floor that wasn't even usable.
Wow.
But it did have a cafeteria, a soda fountain, which was the predecessor to the legendary sweet shop. It had lounges for informal interaction, and it had this very room in which we sit. It was called the Assembly Room, and later the South Ballroom, and that's where their big dances occurred. So it's just amazing to me that at that time, all of a sudden this magnificent building emerges out of fairly barren farmland, and I can only imagine the impact that that had on Purdue students in the Purdue community.
Yes, absolutely. So we say Purdue Memorial Union. What is that significance behind the word memorial?
Well, if you think that only $17,900 was raised in 2 years, after the war, between 1918 and 1921, that increased to almost $1 million. And why is that? Well, I would say that it's because of the 4,013 Purdue men and women that served in that war and the 67 who died. And so quickly it became apparent that they should add the word memorial to Purdue Union. And so that's how the Purdue Memorial Union came into being. And from that point on, with great organization and lots of effort, the money began to pour in. And if I may,
Yes.
at the groundbreaking, Governor Warren T. McRae gave this speech. There were lots of speeches back then. And if I may, I just want to read a little bit to give you the tenor of that feeling of appreciation for those who died in the war.
Yes.
He says, "The building of an enduring and imposing edifice as a memorial to the valor and gallantry of its alumni and student body, who unselfishly and heroically gave up all they held dear to enlist for the defense of their country, is indeed a most deserving and patriotic act. The record of hopes banished, of ambitions forgotten, and opportunities dismissed by the gallant young manhood of the nation constitutes the brightest page in the memorials of the Great War. While we deeply mourn the loss of the men who made the supreme sacrifice, it is not for us to grieve as those without hope. The men who sleep in the halls of death do not ask for grief. They died that the world might be made better and brighter, and that their country might be free from the stain of dishonor. May this structure forever stand as a temple dedicated to the doctrines of peace and goodwill toward men, standing solidly upon the principles of eternal justice and mercy, honesty and righteousness."
That's incredible.
So that is the kind of feeling that was pervasive at the time, and which led to the outpouring of funds that created the Purdue Memorial Union.
And that's a perfect segue. Let's get into some of that symbolism that honors our military right here in PMU.
Certainly. Well, first, the Great Hall itself is a monument to those who gave their lives in the First World War. They called it the Great War back then, and then the World War. They weren't really sure that they would have numbers, unfortunately. But later it was known as World War I. So the Great Hall itself is a monument to those. In the center of the Great Hall on the floor is a golden black cross, and that symbolizes the lives lost by the 67 who died in that war. There are plaques on 3 of the walls in the Great Hall that list those who died in military service in those wars. So World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and then there is also a global memorial plaque, and that is really because we stopped calling them wars. They were military conflicts, and so those record lives lost, say for instance in Iran or in Afghanistan. There is a Battery B flag encased in glass in the Great Hall, and that honors a group of Purdue students who were in Battery B. That was the precursor to ROTC. They were affiliated with the Indian National Guard. And when Pancho Villa invaded New Mexico and the Mexican-American War began, they were called to service. And so that honors Battery B. There is also more recently a POW MIA chair in the Great Hall, and that honors those who were either prisoners of war or missing in action in military service to the country. We have the Dorothy B. Stratton Veteran and Military Success Center up on our second floor northwest. And I guess lastly, I would point to the Veterans Day celebration occurs in the Great Hall every November. This is sponsored by Purdue Student Union Board or PSUB. And if you've never been to one of these events, you're really missing out. It begins with presentation of colors by the Purdue ROTC, the Pledge of Allegiance, of course, speeches by veterans and other officials, patriotic songs by the Purduettes and the Glee Club. And if you've never heard them sing in the wonderful acoustics of the Great Hall, again, you're missing out. And it ends with a 21-gun salute outside the south entrance to the Union.
So we're celebrating 100 years. You know, we talked about the rich history from 1924. Now it's 2024. How has PMU evolved over time?
I like to think that the purpose of the union is the same over those 100 years. And that is to provide a place where students can gather and interact, and most of all, a place where community building can take place. But certainly, as the campus grew, the demands upon the union also grew, and so there were many additions and renovations and improvements that were made. I'd point to just a few. There were 2 additions to the Union Club Hotel during this time, one in 1939 and one in 1955. There was a West addition to the Union added, and thus was added what's now called the West Main Lounge, the West Great Hall, and the North Ballroom. There was an East addition that created a new entrance to the Union from the east, and that created a pathway to the Union Club Hotel. It created the browsing room library, which was later an art gallery, and then a welcome center, and now the dining room of 811 Bistro, that same spot. But it also created a new billiard room and 5 new bowling lanes, which were of great interest to students at that time. But in all of these additions and renovations, I can tell you that great attention was paid to preserving the architectural integrity and the interior design of the Union.
Absolutely. This place is such a historical, significant building on campus. Mm-hmm. So many people who went here, think of PMU kind of in the heart of campus. What do you think makes this stand out from other buildings on campus?
I mean, in terms of like being a landmark?
Yeah.
I would say that this is really the story of Pond and Pond, the architects. I think that Irving K. Pond and Alan B. Pond, who were brothers, they grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And as a small piece of trivia, the Michigan Union sits on the site of the Pond's boyhood home. So they attended the University of Michigan to study architecture, and they eventually moved to Chicago to begin their practice. And in Chicago, they met and befriended Jane Addams, who was a famous Chicago social reformer. And she hired them to design the Whole House. The Whole House is an organization dedicated to service to immigrants to America. They housed them, they fed them, they educated them and their children, they helped them with English as a second language, and in general, they acclimated them to America and helped give them the skills to succeed. So with that sort of tenor, it's easy to see why the Whole House was one of the earliest examples of community building and the college union ideal. The Ponds flourished in Chicago. They were asked to design many, many buildings that had community building as their premise. Eventually, they caught the attention of University of Michigan, and they hired them to build the Michigan Union. And then it wasn't long before this captured the attention of Purdue. At Purdue, the Pond and Pond architects chose the Gothic Revival style of architecture, which we have today. So with its classic towers and gables and intricate ornaments, all of a sudden, a local landmark emerged. I think that one of the things that distinguishes the Ponds from other architects is the great symbolism that they utilized in their architecture. Examples would be, I guess, the Great Hall itself is designed to symbolize the sincerity, ruggedness, and individualism of Purdue students. The upswept, beautiful wooden frames of the windows here are meant to symbolize the youth and spirit of the Purdue Union. And the multicolored stained glass in those windows is meant to reflect the mixing of all colors, races, and creeds at Purdue. And if you think about that and think that that was 1921 or so, you can see that the Pond brothers, who were really part of that whole progressive era in Chicago, their beliefs and their philosophies sort of predated racial integration and religious tolerance in America. So their symbolism was a big part of what the Purdue Memorial Union was and is.
Sure. And how do you think that PMU has shaped our student life over the years?
Well, I think the very design of the union reflects the fact that students can and will use the facilities to determine what they believe is best for them. The lounges for informal interaction, the offices and meeting rooms for student clubs and organizations, certainly dining options to help quell the ever-present student appetite, bowling and billiards to while away whatever free time they had, and of course the ballrooms or the assembly hall where they held some of their big activities. I'm one who believes that there really was no agenda for shaping student life on behalf of Purdue or the Purdue Memorial Union, but I believe that the university recognized that if you provide a facility and if you provide resources to students, student life will take care of itself. And so it really has through the years. In the beginning, there were events like weekly mixers, especially for couples. For those who weren't fortunate enough to have a date, there were the singleton shuffles. There were the big dances with, ballroom dances with orchestras, and some of them big name orchestras. So that was in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. With the advent of rock and roll in the 50s, the music changed, but the student interest remained high. And in the 70s, the whole kind of coffee house thing with acoustic folk music took hold. And so regardless of what era you're talking about, students were quick to take advantage of the Purdue Memorial Union and to really shape their own lives.
I'm sure there's a lot of Boilermaker couples who met from the Singleton Shuffle?
Singleton Shuffles.
What are some of the best services PMU offers students, faculty, and visitors?
Well, starting with visitors and alumni, I would point to the beautiful and recently renovated Union Club Hotel, complete with valet service and parking garage right across the street. I would point to very high quality and upscale catering and beverage operations. And I would point to just wonderful, together with Stewart Center, conference facilities that they can avail themselves from. For faculty and staff who are here on campus every day, probably it's more the meeting rooms to conduct university business, certainly the dining options they take advantage of, and certainly just the ability to interact with students informally is provided by the union. For students, well, there's Starbucks.
That is key.
For students, all of this in the union. Starbucks is just one example. There are many fine dining options that have been provided as part of the recent Atlas Family Marketplace renovation. There's, of course, bowling and billiards. It's now extreme bowling, and the billiard facility has been added to with Boiler Game Mine, video gaming. So I just think there's a lot for them both personally, and if they're interested in getting involved in student activities to help them with student leadership development, that kind of thing, that's here too.
I know I've been to a number of conferences in here, and it's like the epitome of being on a college campus and that nostalgia of sitting in here studying when I was a student and then coming back in here. I know one of the most popular events is the Christmas tree lighting here. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that event and the significance of it, and how long does that span back? Did that start back in 1924?
Well, actually, no. The Christmas tree lighting event is really rather recent in the history of the union. It probably started in the early 2000s.
Oh, wow.
And I can remember, I think the first president who lit the Christmas tree, if you will, was Mitch Daniels. So you have all of these people gathered around the Christmas tree that is yet to be lit. And after some remarks, the president would hit a big red button, and magically the lights would light up. The anecdote behind that, which some people don't know, is that as technical and as technologically savvy as Purdue is, we really had no way to have him push a button and have the tree light up. So one of our faithful staff members, usually Terry Clayton, would be up on the second floor in a utility closet where the electrical service was. And that's why there's a countdown. So you'll see the president go 10, 9, and as it gets down to 0, Terry would flick the switch and no one was the wiser. But the whole business of the tree, that probably started around in the 1930s. And so, more recently, those trees have been donated to Purdue. Before, they used to have them come in on freight cars from Wisconsin and other places. But usually on the first week of December, the Bull Gang from Purdue and other associated volunteers with long ropes would yank that 25 to 30 foot tree through the small doors in the south entrance into the building and put it in its place of prominence. So that has been a wonderful tradition through the years, and it's a community tradition. I think more than anything else, that it's usually around noon on or about December 5th, something like that. You'll see people from the community with their children all around, just waiting to see that Christmas tree come in. I think originally it was probably intended to help Purdue students, some of whom had never been away from home,
Sure.
And give them solace during the holidays.
Do you have any other favorite traditions or annual events that happen at PMU?
Gosh, there are, you can imagine with, somewhere now between maybe 10 and 15,000 events in a year, that there are many significant events that take place here. Certainly those early dances in the 20s, 30s, and 40s were big, especially the junior promenade, they called it. It was shortened to junior prom. And the military ball, these were big events. But there were also, many other events during that time. There was a guest speaker, Clive Jones, who was an AIDS activist, and he appeared and gave a very enthusiastic speech that was well attended in conjunction with the display of the Purdue AIDS quilt, which was co-sponsored by PSUB and the LGBTQ organization. So there were many events like that. One of the biggest ones, of course, is when the Purdue astronauts had their reunion here. That was a big weekend for the union and included, of course, our alumnus Neil Armstrong. For me personally, it was always Saturday mornings of home football game weekends. This is when the President's Council of Purdue would host their meals and festivities here in the ballrooms as part of game day activities. The hotel was sold out. The lounges were filled with alumni sporting their latest Purdue gear. The restaurants were all busy. There was a wonderful brunch. There were remarks by the president afterwards. There was entertainment by the Purduettes or the Glee Club or another PMO organization. And while that was wonderful, it also took a great toll on our staff because, Saturdays aren't always considered a working day, but these certainly were. And I remember talking with them one time in sort of a pep talk. I said, with all of this history and tradition and pomp and circumstance and attendance and excitement, if you can't get excited about working today, you're probably in the wrong business.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
how do you think that, all of these events that you just highlighted have, built the PMU into such an iconic place for the West Lafayette community overall, maybe even if they didn't attend Purdue?
I think it's the architecture, certainly. I think it's the reception that the Purdue Memorial Union has had over the years. I think it's the excitement of students when they're here and how much they say when they're not always aware of it when they're here. Particularly, I'm thinking of students on the Purdue Student Union Board. They're here to have fun and meet guys and gals and do the things that most college students do. But over time, they always point back after they're graduated and have their own jobs at how much they learned as being part of the Purdue Student Union Board and going to Purdue University. So I think the alumni certainly play a big part in this. They come back, they're very faithful, they contribute their time and their effort and their dollars to maintaining, places like the Purdue Memorial Union. So that and the amazing architecture of Pond and Pond, I think that's what lends itself to Purdue Memorial Union being the icon that it is.
Absolutely. You talked about Neil Armstrong earlier. What other notable guests, VIP guests, alumni, who else can you tell us stories about who have visited PMU?
Well, I mentioned the whole business of ballroom dancing in the 20s, 30s, and 40s with big name orchestras. I mean, those weekly mixers and some of those weekly dances had also orchestras. In researching the book, there were, I mean, literally hundreds of orchestras that played here, more local orchestras. But there were some big names. There was Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra with their new lead singer, Frank Sinatra, who played in the North Ballroom.
Wow.
There was Duke Ellington and his solo trumpeter, Louis Armstrong. There was Count Basie and his orchestra. So those were just some of the big names. But then, as music evolved, and a lot of the culture here in the Union with students has to do with music. There were groups like the Dave Brubeck Quartet, Simon and Garfunkel, Harry Chapin, The Temptations, Sonny and Cher. I mean, you name it. A lot of those entertainment celebrities were here from one time or another, and other individuals that were here in the Union, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, all of the Purdue astronauts, of course, Loretta Young, Red Skelton, Nipsey Russell, even the San Diego Chicken mascot stayed here.
Wow.
That's just a few.
Those are some big name musicians who were
Yes.
here back in the day.
Yes,
Wow.
absolutely.
What's a favorite memory for you and during your time leading PMU? If you had to reflect back, one thing that really sticks out.
I would say the one thing that meant the most to me was building a team here who understood the importance of sound financial management, watching that team flourish as their operations became more successful financially and otherwise, and then witnessing all of the amazing capital improvements and other projects that took place because of that improved performance. My favorite anecdotal memory was because most union directors would tell you that their life and career is just one prolonged juggling act. We need you to maintain tradition here. We need you to honor the architecture. We need you to improve operations. We need you to make more money. We need you to add new services. And with all of those, you wonder sometimes if the juggling will ever end. But one day I was walking down the main corridor here and I was behind an alumnus father who had his son with him, who was obviously looking at Purdue as a potential place to have his education. And the father said, "Wow," he said, "this place is just like I remembered it." And the son said, "Well, that may be," he said, "but with seamless Wi-Fi and a Starbucks and all these things to do, it certainly makes sense to me." So, music to my ears.
You maintained the history and you got the Starbucks.
Indeed.
So, reflecting on this 100th birthday, what an incredible milestone. What does that mean to you as a former PMU director, and how does it feel to celebrate this?
Well, I think of, first of all, perhaps what it means to the community, both the Purdue community and the community at large. And I think of terms like gratitude to Purdue for recognizing that the union's an important place and for keeping the union and its spirit alive. I think of continuity in that the union represents a demonstration that some Purdue traditions continue on even after 100 years. And I think of pride that the Purdue University saw fit to maintain the union as it is, and that they understand the contributions that unions make to the students of the future.
Absolutely. Looking ahead to the next 100 years of the PMU, how do you imagine this iconic place will evolve and, continue to meet the needs of our future generations of Boilermakers?
Well, personally, I think that you will see much more of the same. And by that I mean, I think that you will see many amazing and unpredictable things happen here at the union, but all of them with the same sort of purpose, and that is to engage students, to build community, that kind of a thing. And so I have no doubt that even though I can't see 100 years into the future, I have no doubt that the union will continue in its legacy.
Is there anything else that you think is important to share with our listeners, Bob?
As I researched the book that I wrote recently about Purdue Memorial Union, the first 100 years, I recognized just how much effort it took to create this union and to maintain it over the years. And so when I think of all the Herculean efforts that other people have made, I just feel proud and humbled that I've been able to play one small part of it, in it for 21 years is my time here.
Absolutely. Well, we can't thank you enough. This was so fun to reflect on 100 years and celebrate 100 years.
Thank you.